The Trail of Tears was one of the darkest chapters in American history, a forced relocation that resulted in the death of approximately 4,000 Native Americans from the Cherokee Nation alone. It occurred during the 1830s, under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, as part of his administration's policy to move Native American tribes west of the Mississippi River to make room for white settlers. The Cherokee were not the only tribe affected. The Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole also suffered the devastating consequences of this forced march. This tragic event is known as the Trail of Tears, a name that encapsulates the profound sorrow, loss, and suffering experienced by these communities. To understand why 4,000 people died during the relocation, we must consider a combination of political, social, environmental, and health factors that contributed to the calamity. These elements were not only a result of direct government actions but also a broader reflection of the attitude toward Native Americans in the early 19th century and the complete disregard for their rights and humanity. In the early 1800s, white settlers in the southern United States, especially in states like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, were eager to expand their land for agricultural purposes. The discovery of fertile soil for crops such as cotton made these areas highly valuable. However, these lands were already occupied by Native American tribes, notably the Cherokee, who had established sophisticated and successful agricultural communities. As white settlers encroached on their land, tensions rose. Andrew Jackson, elected president in 1828, strongly supported the idea of Indian removal. His belief was that Native Americans were living in the way of American progress and that their relocation to the Western territories would ensure their survival. Jackson's policy was rooted in the assumption that Native Americans could not coexist with white settlers in a society that was expanding rapidly, especially in the context of the growing cotton economy. Jackson's ideas were widely supported by the public, even though the policy was morally reprehensible and economically unjust. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was a piece of legislation that gave Jackson the legal authority to negotiate treaties to move Native American tribes west of the Mississippi. This was seen as a way to solve the so-called Indian problem. The government claimed it would protect Native Americans from the encroachment of white settlers, but in reality, it was a forced displacement aimed at giving land to European Americans. The Cherokee Nation, unlike many other tribes, had tried to assimilate into white culture. They adopted farming practices, developed a written language, and even established a constitution. Despite this, the state of Georgia and other southern states pressured the federal government to force the Cherokee off their land. The Cherokee Nation resisted, and in 1832, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case Worcester v. Georgia, ruled in favor of the Cherokee, declaring that they had a sovereign right to their lands. However, President Jackson refused to enforce the court's decision, and his administration proceeded with the removal process. The Cherokee were initially given the choice to voluntarily relocate west to what is now Oklahoma or remain in their ancestral lands in the southeastern U.S. Those who chose to remain were forcibly removed, and the process began in 1838. The Cherokee were divided into groups and began the long and harrowing journey westward. The route stretched over 1,000 miles and crossed through rough, unfamiliar terrain. The journey took months, and many tribes were forced to travel in the harshest of conditions. The Trail of Tears was not a single, well-organized trek but a series of movements that included large groups and smaller detachments. Along the way, the Cherokee were confined to overcrowded camps, where sanitation and food were scarce. The lack of resources, combined with the oppressive weather, was a deadly combination for the tribes. Disease was rampant, and the conditions were unbearable for the elderly, children, and those in poor health. The primary reason so many Cherokee people died during the Trail of Tears was the physical and environmental conditions they faced during the relocation process. The following factors were significant contributors to the death toll. Harsh weather conditions. The relocation occurred during the colder months of the year. The Cherokee traveled through freezing temperatures, rain, and snow. The cold weather took a severe toll on their health, making them vulnerable to illness. Many of the travelers did not have proper clothing or shelter to protect themselves from the elements. Disease and malnutrition. The journey was marked by rampant disease, especially dysentery, typhus, and pneumonia. Unsanitary conditions, limited access to clean water, and overcrowded camps created the perfect breeding grounds for disease. Many of the elderly, children, and those already weakened by previous hardships succumbed to illness. Malnutrition was also a significant problem as food was scarce, and rations were insufficient for such a large number of people. Exhaustion. The journey was long and arduous. Many of the Cherokee were already weakened by previous years of stress, loss, and displacement. The constant moving, combined with the physical toll of walking through rough terrain, left many too exhausted to continue. Some fell behind and were left to die along the trail. Poor treatment by U.S. troops. While the majority of the soldiers assigned to guard the Cherokee during the journey were indifferent to their plight, many were outright cruel. There were instances of mistreatment, violence, and neglect. Some soldiers confiscated the food and supplies meant for the Cherokee or provided inadequate resources for the journey. The soldiers' lack of empathy for the suffering of the Native Americans contributed to the high death toll. Psychological trauma. In addition to the physical toll, the psychological impact of the journey cannot be overstated. The Cherokee were forced to leave their ancestral lands, which were integral to their identity and culture. The emotional weight of the loss, combined with the uncertainty of their future, added to the trauma they experienced. This trauma had a long-lasting effect on the survivors, who had to rebuild their communities in an unfamiliar and hostile land. The scale of the journey, the sheer number of people involved in the relocation made the logistics of the journey more challenging. Tens of thousands of people were being moved at once, and the infrastructure to support such a large group was insufficient. The Cherokee were divided into multiple groups, and the coordination of food, medical supplies, and shelter was inconsistent, which resulted in even more deaths. Separation from families. Families were often torn apart during the relocation. While the groups were supposed to travel together, some families were separated, and the elderly and sick were left behind. Many children lost their parents, and many parents lost their children during the journey. This loss of family members compounded the emotional and psychological trauma experienced by those who survived. When the Cherokee and other tribes finally reached the Western Territories, the survivors were left to rebuild their communities from scratch. While they were now in a new land, they had been fundamentally changed by their experiences. Many of the people who survived the Trail of Tears would spend the rest of their lives mourning the loss of their families, homes, and way of life. The death of approximately 4,000 Cherokee people on the Trail of Tears is not just a historical fact, but a painful reminder of the broader policy of Native American removal that decimated entire cultures and communities. The Cherokee's suffering on the Trail of Tears serves as a symbol of the larger pattern of mistreatment that Native Americans endured throughout U.S. history. In the years following the relocation, the Cherokee Nation managed to rebuild to some extent, but the scars of the forced migration remained. Many survivors found it difficult to adjust to their new environment, and the loss of life during the journey affected the future of the tribe. The consequences of the Trail of Tears were felt not just by the Cherokee, but by all Native American tribes who were subjected to similar treatment under the Indian Removal Act. The deaths on the Trail of Tears were not just the result of poor planning or unfortunate circumstances. They were the direct result of a government policy that dehumanized Native Americans and treated them as obstacles to American progress. Today, the Trail of Tears remains a somber part of American history, and its lessons are as relevant as ever. Understanding the history of the Trail of Tears is crucial to acknowledging the injustices faced by Native American communities and ensuring that such mistakes are not repeated. For many Native Americans, the Trail of Tears is not merely a distant historical event, but a painful legacy that continues to affect their lives and their communities. The loss of life, culture, and sovereignty during this forced relocation remains a central part of the narrative of Native American history. The Cherokee, along with other tribes, continue to honor the memory of their ancestors who suffered and died on the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears is a tragic reminder that the price of progress should never be paid by the innocent and vulnerable. The 4,000 deaths on the Cherokee Trail of Tears were not an accident, they were a consequence of a deliberate policy designed to force Native Americans off their land. Today, we must remember their suffering and work to ensure that the lessons of the past are never forgotten.